Hello everyone, Astrichthyes here. Today I bring you a video discussing the upcoming Demon's Souls remake. It might be a bit disorganized, but I wrote it as a stream of consciousness, following my ideas as they came to me. As I'm sure most are aware, the official Demon's Souls servers shut down February 28, 2018, and have been thought long dead by the majority of the Soulsborne community, but it lives on with a private server hosted by UV, which is how I was able to obtain all of the multiplayer footage in this video. Even knowing that this server exists, there has been outcry from the Souls community for a remaster, and BluePoint is going the extra mile with a ground-up remake. A lot of people said they would have preferred a Demon's Souls remaster to Dark Souls remastered due to age priority, and the fact that the servers for the original Dark Souls are still up and running. So the demand was there, but what can we expect from what has primarily been a remaster-oriented studio? This video discusses that and goes into pretty extreme depth on what BluePoint needs to do if they want to make this remake successfully live up to the reputation of the original and potentially improve upon it. And before we really dig into this, please be aware that much of the latter portion of the video is given with a PvP-focused perspective. That's not to say it's not important, even to players who don't necessarily want to PvP in it. The fact is, if the game has invasions, then these are details that will be both relevant and important for your success as an invader, as well as against them when you're trying to co-op, or just running through the level hoping they won't show up. And I promise, they will. That said, let's dive in. I've been playing Souls since shortly after Demon's Souls came out, and I've played every Soulsborne game to date, minus that one weird single-player combat rhythm game people lump into the Soulsborne franchise. I think I have a fair idea of what we can expect when we do get this remake. And having played meta PvP for years, I also know what changes the remake would need to have better PvP than the original and still offer the relatively balanced, or should I say equally broken, experience the game has to offer. One way to look at what a Demon's Souls remake would be like is to look at the treatment Dark Souls Remastered got. The PS4 version of Dark Souls Remastered included the following changes from the original game, disregarding game-specific changes such as bonfire locations. Other important changes include the removal of dead angles and ghost strikes, which are attacks that can bypass blocking and do full damage and stagger. Given how powerful the shields in the Souls series have traditionally been, especially Demons and Dark Souls, this is somewhat of a critical glitch for PvP, because it is a direct counter to turtling, an otherwise extremely powerful tactic that can dominate PvP. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's discuss each important change that Dark Souls Remastered made, and how it might translate over into a Demon's Souls remake, if BluePoint uses it as a reference. This of course assumes BluePoint will even attempt to recreate the intense multiplayer experience that the original pioneered. Be prepared, this is a very long section. Unlike Dark Souls 1 and 3, healing items in Demon's Souls are all consumables, with a maximum carry limit of 99 per item. I suspect the item burden system will remain the same, however I do believe they will drastically lower the number of healing items that may be carried per item. You might be tempted to say right now, oh, just change this to something like Estus. That is a massive and fundamental change to the entire game. Estus had its own issues, such as having upgrades that gave twinks an easy advantage over hosts at low level, but I'm not going to get into detail here because this ain't Dark Souls. Stop trying to make this game another Dark Souls. We already had 3. We don't need another. I digress. The minimum I would recommend is 10 per grass and 10 per spice, with an upper limit of 20 grass total. They could also implement a system of grass carry limits scaling inversely with the quality of grass, such that high-grade grass would be much more limited than low-grade grass. The same could be said for spices. For example, you could carry 1 dark moon grass, 3 new moon grass, 5 full moon grass, and so on. Now it's worth noting that with the current system of practically unlimited grass, the invader or duelist was not subject to being worn down, and had the option of sparring, which is fighting each other until one of you breaks second chance and then resetting the fight, but I believe allowing practically unlimited healing would carry with it terrible consequences, the least of which is 20-minute-plus fights, where both the host and invader are running for each other's backs constantly to punish the heal, and ultimately getting nowhere until one player messes up. Limiting spices, however, carries with it its own set of problems. Something that Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 casters suffer from is that they can be stalled out in PvP. With relative ease, I might add. They have a limited number of casts per attunement slot in Dark Souls 1, and a split between Ashen Estus and Healing Estus in Dark Souls 3. Now, if you were to face a 3-man gank in either game and cast your strongest spells, you might hit them, but you'll also lose a significant chunk of FP or deplete your spell count. And then when they heal, your progress is lost and your resources are proportionally less than what your opponent lost. In an extended engagement, whether it is a gank or a duel, the caster is susceptible to being run dry, in which case the caster simply becomes a weak melee build. The only way they could overcome this limitation in a Demon Souls remake is increasing the MP regen on the respective equipment carrying that effect, which are Crescent Weapons, Phosphorescent Pole, and Fragrant Ring. I wouldn't be opposed to having this effect scale with your magic stat personally, or you could have some weird mechanic where co-ops or invaders get grass and spices from killing their opponent. But really, how would that work when it's a physical consumable item? Furthermore, I'd like to point out that cutting available healing and MP replenishing items for invaders and co-ops in half is not a solution. Invaders already have lower HP and are likely to be outnumbered. Reducing their resources only gimps them more. The way the game is balanced, the host and the invader are on relatively equal ground in a 1v1, which only shifts in favor of the host when they start summoning phantoms. And since it would make no sense for a phantom of either party to give back heals and spices upon death, as these are still consumables, they would need to prevent resummoning of phantoms during a session with an invader, which otherwise wears the invader down. The invader is meant to be a direct threat to the host and an obstacle to overcome on their way to the boss. Nerfing them into the ground is only going to take away from the original intended experience of invading and being invaded. A game of survival for the host, and a hunt where the invader tries to kill them. And to balance grass, they need to make the healing effect a percent of the player's host HP. In other words, summons heal the same amount of HP per grass as they would if they were a host. This will help address the issue of players abusing full heals from the likes of New Moon and Dark Moon grass, especially in the case of a host summoning more blues to fight with or for them. Fixed spawn points that place you as close to the host as possible are a problem that plagued both the original Dark Souls and the remaster, which ultimately led to situations where the invader could easily be trapped by gankers and spawn killed. Demon Souls had this as well. Every level was divided into sections, which were separate zones that determined where the invader would spawn. In order to invade a host, though, the invader needs to have an active invasion search in the same zone. So if the host was in Zone 2 and the invader was invading in Zone 1, they wouldn't meet. In addition to making it much harder to invade throughout the game, as the invader would have to actively move between zones to reliably find invasions, it also guaranteed that a solo host could watch their Nexial Binding, Shard of Archstone, or Evacuate Miracle, and accurately predict when and where an invader would come in. Furthermore, knowing exactly where the invader would spawn in within a zone, without variation, easily allowed ganks to surround and kill the invader as they spawned in with extreme reliability. This would be easy to fix by simply moving spawn points to locations where they cannot be trapped or surrounded, or give the invader a brief period of no clip upon spawn so that they can pass through spawn campers. Another idea is to have dynamic spawn points where the invader can choose where they spawn in, as was implemented in Bloodborne. The only problem this presents is the player being able to spawn out of bounds. I think it's safe to assume that spawn points may remain fixed, however there will be no way of knowing until the Demon Souls remake is released. Let's just hope they do something about this potential issue. Given the scale of the original game, it would be totally unrealistic to increase the maximum player limit for Demon Souls. A party of 3 already destroys the game with ease, so upping the player limit makes no sense. Furthermore, can you imagine fighting a party of 4 spawn camping hyperspray mages? Or 4 turtles with scraping spears and acid cloud? Or even a party of 3 surrounding you on spawn, shields up while a 4th casts Spanish and instantly sends you packing, while also draining a soul level from you? I also don't think the game would be able to handle 4 players spamming clouds back to back, or AMF, which could already tank your frame rate, let alone end an entire session with 2 to 3 players doing it on the original. My hope is that they maintain a player limit of 4 in order to preserve the intended difficulty of the game and prevent excessive griefing of invaders and red sign duelists, the latter of which are penalized by losing a soul level every time they die, leave, or disconnect from a host's world. I wouldn't be opposed to having the ability to summon 2 red signs so that 2v2s could potentially happen. The reds could either be treated as a team or allowed to be hostile to each other, which ultimately would change some of the dynamics of duels and invasions. But given how Dark Souls 3 handles it, I'd say it's better to not allow friendly fire between reds if they do up the multiplayer limit. But if they do decide to up this limit, they definitely need some parameters in place to prevent things like 5v1s, which I've had the pleasure to survive and win against only once in Dark Souls 3. And they need to consider how they can maintain the invader as an actual threat. One way to do this would be to give the invader buffs based on the number of summons, like what the Spears of the Church did on Dark Souls 3. For those of you who don't know, Spears of the Church is basically a revision of the old monk boss of Demon Souls. The spear gains additional poise, defense, FP, which is almost equivalent to MP, resistances, and stamina based on the number of opponents they'll face. However, they lose the ability to heal besides regen, miracles, and healing by the painting guardians that are summoned to fight alongside them. Clearly, this is very biased toward faith builds, which would be no different in the Demon Souls remake, so they'd have to think of a way to balance that out by keeping the buffs low enough that the invader doesn't become an absolute god, but high enough that they'll stand even a decent chance against otherwise overwhelming odds. And for those of you thinking this would be unfair in favor of the invader, bear in mind that the PvE in Soulsborne games usually gets a substantial buff to compensate for summon count, while the invader is still on par with, or more likely, statistically disadvantaged against any one of the players in that session because of how matchmaking ranges work. And they're still neutral to some enemies, such as dragons, and thus able to take damage from them. At the very least, I think this idea of buffs would be of immense help for the monk boss fight, so long as they properly balance the fight. As is, the monk boss is highly favorable for a few very specific setups, such as Cursed Dragon Bone Smasher and Vidgouge Northern Regalia, which I'll discuss later. One of the biggest arguments against this buff system is that it will substantially alter the balance of duels, as hosts would no longer be able to bring blues into their world to fight invaders and red sign duelists. The only way to make it a fair duel would be to make it so red signs don't grant the red their normal buff. However, this would also incentivize selectively trolling duelists. This idea might be more appropriate in a game where duels were absolutely not intended. Regardless of what they do here, there are other issues to worry about. If they implement password summons, which I suspect they're likely to do, they need to either downscale phantoms a lot harder, or better yet, only make it so the host can summon within their normal range, or just a little beyond that normal range. In other words, make the password a simple filter to prevent random summoning. The main issue with the way password summons are implemented in Dark Souls 3 is that you can summon and resummon your overleveled friends who are not properly downscaled, and they still carry advantages such as high poise and weapon buffs that are unaffected by the downscaling. The result is Havel monsters spamming something like buffed Sellsword Twin Blades, straight swords with ridiculous DPS, or ultras that can still take a third of your health per hit, despite taking a damage cut. Let's not even talk about vestiges taking half your health in one hit and resetting stun. Please. Worse yet, you can also meet unscaled players, which are glitched password summons who no longer have matchmaking downscaling applied, and they retain all advantages from being a higher level. More damage, more defense, and more HP. Rather than complicate things with downscaling formulas that simply don't work as well as they should, just omit overleveled summons altogether. Problem solved. At the very least, let's just hope they don't copy everything Dark Souls 3 or Dark Souls Remastered did with password summons, because a copy-pasted system will only lead to the same results. Something that has been a long-time problem with the Souls games, but has become much more prominent in recent times, is intentional disconnects in multiplayer to avoid invasions. For a long time on Reddit, there have been users trying to justify and promote the use of disconnects to avoid invasions. Now, I won't get into too much detail here on how and why it's a bad thing, because Demon's Souls, unlike Dark Souls, had minimal rewards and no covenants. I've even heard suggestions for the game to have a menu option to disable the ability for invaders to come in, but doing this would almost completely eliminate the possibility for invaders to find hosts, because hardly anyone would choose to keep invasions open. We should all acknowledge the fact that invasions were an intended mechanic to offset the advantages of host HP and having the option to co-op. I also want it to be very clear that the player disconnecting is not the victim. They deliberately end a session outside the normal means of the game, and ultimately waste the time and often consumable resources of the opposing party. Something that can be done to address disconnects is in-game consequences. If a Demon's Souls invader dies to status, environmental hazards, leaves via Whitestone, or disconnects from a session, they are penalized with losing a soul level. Similarly, Red Sign duelists lose a level if they die, white out, or disconnect. To discourage disconnects, I believe it would be a fair penalty for anyone who disconnects from a multiplayer session, namely one where a red is present, to lose a level as a consequence, besides using a white eye stone. Rather than a ban, which solo hosts running the game are completely numb to, and might even prefer, the player sees a tangible and significant loss of character progression that allows them to continue to play and will continue to punish them for repeated infractions. And in cases of disconnects, it would be suitable to reward the opposing party with the souls of that level, as well as any other rewards that would be granted from a successful kill. This principle would apply to hosts and phantoms as well if an invader intentionally disconnects. I'd rather see this idea implemented than anything as drastic as temporary bans preventing multiplayer, because it will encourage players to follow the intended experience. Play in soul form, or offline to avoid invasions, or play in body form with the potential to summon and have invasions to offset the benefits of host advantage. And the invader will be compensated for time otherwise wasted in the event the host disconnects, which will help them recover consumables they expended in the session, while also being held accountable if they're on the other side of that. As an addendum to this, it would be necessary to have exceptions to this rule in cases of sessions ending because of excessive lag or server outages. That said, let's move on to the next topic. At first thought, you might think, why is this in here? But part of what made Demon's Souls what it is was the way you could interact with other players in-game. Obviously, holding X for 5 seconds just to gesture was bad, and the motion controls for gestures absolutely sucked, so that would need to change. But what I really wanted to touch on here is that unlike all of the Dark Souls franchise, Demon's Souls did not have a point-down gesture, or really any gesture that was considered as offensive as any of the notorious gestures trolls, gankers, and salty players could do to show disrespect in the other games. Looking at you, Dark Souls 3, with your dung pies, point downs, and well, what is it? Most players from modern Souls might think or say, bro, it's just a gesture in a video game, why do you care? But they might not realize something. Even if the gesture is essentially meaningless, it's still a negative interaction. And when 90% of your interactions in a given day are negative, it makes complete sense when players get burned out, or don't feel like diving back into that negativity, because most of us are playing to have fun and maybe enjoy the thrill of some friendly competition, or an honest invasion with no hard feelings. I'll admit, I've often become very frustrated playing Dark Souls 3, pointed down, and on the rare occasion, dung-pied a player who I absolutely thought deserved it. Players that are extremely passive, players taunting with reaction rolls and standing still, players abusing game-breaking glitches, co-invaders turning on you while you're fighting a gank, players running away almost endlessly, hosts resummoning phantoms for the umpteenth time and eventually wearing you down or getting a lucky stun lock with their buddies and taking your full HP bar. I'm not saying it's right to show disrespect through gestures, But it's also part of the culture Dark Souls created, where most interactions end with a point down, or some other way to disrespect or taunt an opponent, which is far removed from what Demon Souls was like back in the day. The fact that Demon Souls did not have gestures with overtly negative connotations made it hard to BM another player in such a way that it provoked a response. If BluePoint takes this into consideration and they simply recreate gestures, rather than create more to emulate what Dark Souls did, then I believe we may see a more positive, more respectful, less toxic, and less salty gathering for PvP than any of the original Demon Souls successors. What we know is that the remake is going to have two different modes that affect frame rate and resolution. What we don't know is how that is going to affect the game. Since this is a ground-up remake, it is doubtful that we will see significant problems from players interacting with two different frame rates. Those players you might meet on PC Dark Souls Prepare to Die Edition running 60 FPS and lagging to hell are very unlikely to be an example of what we can expect. That's not to say it definitely won't affect online interactions. They may just separate players based on which mode they are playing on, too. As for the resolution, I'm sure it will look great no matter which mode you're in. And I'm actually not too picky about this since I care more about mechanical performance than appearance. And since we're talking about Demon Souls mechanics here, if you didn't already know, there are a lot of weird bugs that made the game what it was, for better or worse. Mostly better. We've all seen the trailers and the screenshots. I've seen a lot of mixed opinions on the new look of things in the remake, and I figured now is as good a time as any to give my opinion. I'm being completely honest here. No bias, I promise. But I think there are some things about this remake's look that just aren't there for me. One of the keystones of the atmosphere of the original was the colorless fog and clues hidden everywhere that suggest there was a recent mass exodus or extermination of the large majority of Boletaria's inhabitants. I mean, you can find relatively fresh food on tables. And the presence of the fog was not only a clever way to fool the eye into thinking the game's graphics were better than they actually were, but it also gave this looming feeling that the doom of this land was not only inevitable, but imminent. The remake doesn't have that fog, which I find a little weird since it was backed by the lore. I think it'd honestly be a big design mistake to omit that. Now, let's rip into the enemies. Metaphorically. I'll be nicer than most of the criticisms I've read. Flame Lurker. He's a big, fiery, angry, and weird-looking demon. His flesh is partially melted and run down his face. Flame Incarnate? I can see that. I also see some resemblance between him and Big M, the blacksmith featured on the Stonefang Archstone, which may have some lore implications. This new look screams retrograded Smelter Demon more than Flaming Berserker to me. I think if they're going to redeem this one, they need to make him look less like a lava demon on the cooldown, and more like flesh-made lava that's also on fire demon. The Dragon God. I always thought his design was a little silly with the second set of jaws inside its maw, but he looked quite powerful, shredded, pure muscle over bone. He was a pretty damn good-looking boss. No, dragons aren't my fetish. And in shots I took, like this one, you can't help but feel like he's just overwhelmingly powerful. Then I saw the Dragon God in the trailer, and some things didn't make sense to me. 1. Why does the Dragon God's head now look like a Xenomorph Queen's? 2. Why is he more plated and less scaly? 3. Why is the Dragon God reveal done in the open moonlight with Gothic spires? Boletaria was essentially designed like a blocky Minas Tirith. The absolute best thing I saw in the trailer that genuinely had me excited was the reveal of the Storm King in an actual storm. Yes, just yes. Thank you. And that's all I have to say on this topic. Another thing that really bothered me about the reveal was that the fluted set emulates the Elite Knight set from Dark Souls, rather than sticking to the original stylized design. The helm of the original game was one of the most iconic pieces of equipment in the game, right next to the monk's head wrap. I think it'd be a mistake to redesign the armor to look better when it'd not only look good if they upscaled the detail on the original design, but they would avoid the criticisms that are sure to come from longtime fans. Now, given my extensive background as a PvPer, how the game ultimately looks will be second to how it feels and performs mechanically, which begs the question, what will they change, and will they look at the original game's charms as imperfections, like many of the glitches that made it what it is? Demon's Souls is glitchy as hell. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. But the way they all work together makes them much greater than the sum of their parts. The best way I'd describe their role is unintentional self-balancing. I've already mentioned Ghost Strikes and Dead Angles, which reserve merit in their own respective roles in PvP for addressing the potency of shields in this game. Some other glitches to look at are Toggle Escape, Duping, Pivot Cast, and Spell Swap, all of which are extremely unlikely to make it into the remake. Now you might normally think that glitch removal would be a good thing for any game, but I hope you can see why I have reservations about completely annihilating them for this special case, and possibly understand the benefits of trying to emulate some of these glitches as intended mechanics. From the top, let's take a look at each of them and decide what effects they have on the game, and what their removal would entail if everything else was left alone. Toggle Escape is a glitch that grants you a brief window of hyper armor when you swap weapons, preventing you from staggering and thus allowing you to get out of stunlock. This includes the infamous pushlock combo of dual katanas, a combo that indefinitely stunlocks until your opponent is out of stamina, and can quite literally kill you through second chance in a single touch. Now, if stunlock were to be removed or minimized and pushlock was abolished, this would not be a terrible glitch to lose. It simply depends on what combos are left in the game after they tweak the frame rate and possibly the stagger or speed of attacks and pushes that allow for pushlock. If stunlock remains the same or worsens and this glitch is removed, I think it's safe to say we will see a huge shift in what weapons and builds are competitive or even viable. Pivot Cast and Spell Swap are both glitches that rely on the animation your character makes when pivoting, but one is not like the other. Pivot Cast is a glitch that accelerates the casting speed of a spell. No, this is not on the level of the bow glitch for Dark Souls 3, which makes some casts completely unavoidable. And that's also considered a spell swap glitch, by the way. This is very different. Given how fast they are at normal casting speed, projectile spells such as Fireball and Soul Ray would be too slow to effectively use in PvP unless your opponent messed up. Bad. But pivot casting is interesting because you can only change the timing of your spell release within a tight window. In other words, you get a faster cast with slight adjustment in timing. The irony is that this glitch makes spells usable with a high skill ceiling for technical play, but it is by no means broken. In fact, it's still extremely easy to counter. Now let's have a look at Spell Swap. Unlike Pivot Cast, this glitch is genuinely game-breaking, allowing you to do things such as running Firestorm and instant God's Wrath. The twist here is that it relies on the same glitch Pivot Cast relies on, but it is also tied to animation cues, which cause your character to swap the animation of one spell to another. My personal hope is that they try to stay as true to the original as possible and retain Pivot Cast as an intended mechanic, but I'm very biased here, and this is a very far-flung pipe dream. I put many hundreds of hours into perfecting the various ways to use Pivot Cast effectively in PvP, and every single PvPer that I've ever talked to has said it was only ever a good thing. Even players who didn't delve into it themselves. The minimum that would need to be done, though, is make adjustments to ensure casting remains competent if they don't emulate Pivot Cast. There are multiple duping methods in the game. One exploits the fact that autosave is disabled when you're in co-op, allowing you to transfer gear and items and disconnect in order to retain a copy of the gear you dropped, while also giving a full set to your friend. The other main method is perceptively a storage glitch, which allows you to duplicate any consumable indefinitely. I suspect that the method of this reduces Thomas's deposited inventory to -1, resulting in that number rolling back around to 1023, but the semantics of this glitch aren't exactly pertinent for this discussion. All it means is that picking up one of any consumable, ore, or soul can grant you an infinite supply of that item if you use this glitch. Given how you could carry stacks of grass and hardly stand a chance of running out, and that consumables will likely have a much lower carry limit, I think the main reason for removing this glitch will be soul duping, as you can technically reach max soul level without ever leaving the Nexus once you've killed the Phalanx. Now, granted, you'd have to spend months doing so with the soul you can get in the Nexus, but you can dupe boss souls and use those. Or if they make a quality of life adjustment, such as allowing you to use an entire stack of basic consumable souls at once, you could potentially reach max level in a matter of days, if not hours. Since it's unlikely we'll have a permanent duping method, and I'm sure someone will find one or two that will be promptly patched out, I hope that some convenience is brought in to compensate. That means increasing ore drop rates, especially pure ores that are extremely rare, such as pure bladestone, which has about a 1% chance to drop under ideal conditions. They should also consider making consumables more accessible to buy, which can be accomplished by making the blacksmith in the Nexus carry more exotic items as you progress through New Game and kill bosses, while also retaining the ability to purchase all of those unlocked items in New Game Plus, something that Dark Souls 3 should have done, but sadly and infuriatingly didn't. And to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't be opposed to having the option of buying pure ores from various NPC merchants in New Game Plus for an exorbitant amount of souls, just to mitigate RNG and streamline character progression so that you don't necessarily have to do 3 to 4 playthroughs to get every single weapon upgraded for your particular build. Something that Demon Souls did differently from the other Souls games is that Backstabs could be iframed. This inherently brought greater importance to the neutral game in PvP, while still allowing this to exist as an easy counter for the absurd healing grass had to offer. If they changed the Backstabs to always deal damage, like Dark Souls did, then we can only expect the game to become a clone of Dark Souls with a different look. And if they make Backstabs more like Dark Souls 3, given how fast Demon Souls PvP is compared to it, then it will create an environment that is no longer balanced between lighter and heavier weapons. In other words, it will make dex builds even better than they historically were, which was already top tier. Shifting our focus to shields, they absolutely need to address the issue of stability being way too high for most shields. In most cases, a large weapon consumes more stamina than the stamina damage it can deal against a shield guard. I mean, Knight Shield has 78 stability, which is heavy Great Shield status in Dark Souls 3. Guard breaks not being reliably punishable for slow weapons like Great Hammers, Great Axes, and Ultra Great Swords was another problem. If you guard break a shield with a 2-hand Great Axe R1 and continue through the 3-hit combo, the player you guard broke can potentially block the second attack with as little as 1 stamina and be guard broken again with no risk of punishment. Should they block the third R1, they will take full damage and be knocked down, but if they're smart, they can simply choose to roll the third R1 and effortlessly backstab you while recovering from being out of stamina. Now this doesn't always happen, but it's something that I reliably saw against certain players when I mained the Meat Cleaver in PvP and fought particularly latent turtles. In order to address this, they can simply lengthen the guard broken animation, and if they add the ability to guard break riposte, that'd be even better. Lastly, it would be great if backstabs weren't blockable with a shield. Okay, thanks. Although it was relatively balanced for the most part, the game has room to be correctly rebalanced. Now we can't honestly expect a remake to be perfect in every way. It's likely there will be a mix of good and bad changes. All we can really hope for is more good than bad. Of all the Souls games, I think Demon Souls has some of the most broken gear, and some of it is completely ridiculous. The main things I've identified that need significant changes are Cursed Weapon, Anti-Magic Field, Dragon Bone Smasher, Brammed, Northern Regalia, Adjudicator Shield, Dark Silver Shield, and Hyper Mode. Honorable mentions for welcome buffs are the Penetrator Sword, Epi Rapier, and Easterel. There are plenty more things I can add to this list because they either need a slight buff or nerf, but I'd like to focus on the short list of important changes. Let's go down the list systematically. Cursed Weapon is a buff that increases physical damage dealt by 50% at the cost of some HP drain, much like Power Within from Dark Souls. It does, however, benefit from a glitch caused by using the buff with a catalyst that is either broken or that you do not meet the recs for, which reduces the HP drain of the buff to a very small amount that is easily overcome with any single source of regen. The buff was powerful enough that when the meta started to die down, it became taboo to use because it could end fights in as little as 2 hits. And that's including Second Chance, a miracle that gives you 50% of your HP back upon death, much like Tears of Denial. What needs to be done to bring this spell into line is reduce the buff to 30% and fix the glitch that causes HP drain to be reduced to almost nothing. The best way to describe this spell is an internal lag switch, or a DDoS generator. It's supposed to work like Vow of Silence from Dark Souls, only the range is huge and it creates a massive amount of lag. You think you've seen bad lag? AMF will literally cause you to backstab each other from halfway across the map, and can actually end sessions. Out of all the things to watch for, BluePoint needs to be especially wary of repeating the dreadful mistake of creating a lag nuke like this miracle. If they do manage to make it work properly, I really hope they reduce the range and duration, because it will be completely busted if they don't. The DBS is the most powerful pure physical weapon in the game, capping at 560 AR with 99 strength, or 66 strength in 2 hands. It provides a passive fire defense buff and is also capable of accepting a weapon buff. It also deals incredible damage in PvP, coming in at over 1300 damage unbuffed on a backstab. Not only that, but a cursed DBS 2-hand running R1 roll catch can one-shot a full HP 50 vit host. For reference, 50 vit is 1500 HP as a host, and 1050 HP as a Phantom or Invader with Cling Ring on. The weight of this weapon, 20 units, was not enough to justify its power, as you can still fast roll with even some medium armor on at 40 endurance. For these reasons, I believe the following changes need to happen. 1. Reduce the maximum AR by about 40 points. Dropping the base AR by about 20 points would effectively do this. 2. Remove the ability to buff the weapon since it is already incredibly powerful and provides a buff to your fire defense. 3. Add a bit of a delay to the attack animation of the 2-hand running R1 to help account for pre-hits that often occur with a little bit of latency. This would probably not affect the tier of the weapon much, as it's still extremely powerful and will ultimately be the defensive variant of the Crushing Greatsword, although probably still more powerful. The Brammed takes its place on this list as the only weapon that I deem needed some sort of significant buff. It is by far the heaviest weapon in the game, almost double the weight of the DBS at 36 units. For that reason, it will typically require you to use the Ring of Great Strength in order to use it with any armor or secondary weapon. It is weaker than the Crushing Great Axe, which weighs only 10 units. Now it does grant passive disease resistance, which is nice. It's also blunt, so it can guard break shields easily. However, it still suffers from being too slow and weak to adequately punish on guard breaks. The weapon gets a measly 420 AR with max strength. While it may be buffed, the Crushing Great Axe is superior in every way, reaching 471 AR at 99 strength with the same capacity for a weapon buff. The brand needs a reduction in weight to make it more accessible, or it needs a hefty buff in damage. I would reduce the weapon's weight to 24 units, and buff it by at least 50 to 60 AR to make it worth using, because it simply isn't unless you're doing a cosplay. Regardless, if the change I suggested for extending guard break animations is implemented, then this weapon may see justification for its use, even without the buffs I have recommended, although that's unlikely. So let's talk about Northern Regalia. It's a large sword that has a pretty modest stat rec, and scales only with your character tendency. It reaches a maximum of 540 AR with an even split between magic and physical damage. Now given this is the weapon the final boss uses against you, and that it takes the final boss's soul and both Soulbrand and Demon Brand being fused together, it makes sense why it's powerful, but it's too powerful. The weapon has no stat scaling. So long as you meet the minimum recs for it, you can deal maximum damage with it. It turns out this weapon has similar AR to a Moon or Blessed Greatsword +5 with the minimum strength rec and 50 in their respective primary damage stat. Now we're comparing a non-scaling large sword with a min-maxed ultra greatsword, and they have similar AR? Not only that, but the Northern Regalia's lack of scaling makes it easy to gouge vitality and still deal at least 1100 damage on a backstab in PvP, or it can be used to creep at low levels. The solution here is to reduce the AR of this weapon by about 40, 20 physical and 20 magic AR, and by extension, Soulbrand and Demon Brand would require a similar nerf. It would still be quite powerful, but much more reasonable in terms of damage versus investment. And now we come to the meta shields. Let's start with the Adjudicator shield. It's a wooden great shield with pretty poor resistances and stability, but it carries a powerful HP regen effect. 8 HP per tick is nothing to scoff at, since it stacks with other regen effects from blessed weapons, 6 HP at +5, and Regenerator's Ring, 4 HP. In total, a Faith build can regenerate 18 HP per second, not including the Regeneration Miracle that adds an additional 1% of your max HP in regen per second. So what needs to be done here? The answer is simple. Reduce the regen of the shield from 8 HP per second to 4 HP per second. It will still retain its primary use, but this nerf will help bring regen back to reasonable levels. Bear in mind, 2 +5 blessed weapons don't stack regen. At best, you would have to use a +5 and a +4 blessed weapon to stack regen, and the effect would be identical to the nerfed Adjudicator shield. The second shield on the list is what I regard as the most powerful shield in all of Soulsborne, proportionally speaking. The Dark Silver shield boasts 100% physical reduction, 100% magic reduction, 70% fire reduction, a pretty hefty 65 stability, and a passive 30% magic defense buff that is multiplicative with your natural magic defense, which scales with faith. And the Ring of Magical Dullness, no less. The shield is so powerful that it completely shuts down mages, neuters the damage of magical weapons if it isn't used to block them, and makes for turtles that are very difficult to take down. In fact, it completely defined the Japanese meta. So what needs to be done about this? Well, everything. I exaggerate, but let's go over some changes that would bring this thing down from God tier to still very good. If that stability was reduced from 65 to 50, the shield would be easier to guard break, but unless they make a change to address the brief guard break animation that's currently in place, it may not make much of a difference. The second major change would be to remove the passive magic defense buff. This buff, stacked with High Faith and Ring of Magical Dullness, neuters any sort of opposing build that deals magical damage. Removing the buff would only affect magic damage dealt for attacks that haven't been blocked. But is that even enough? I'm not so sure. The last change I'd recommend is one of the 3 resistances need to be cut down. The best candidate is honestly fire, which should sit somewhere around a 30% reduction. This would help make dragon weapons a viable counter to the shield, and give mages a better chance against turtles that would still otherwise shut them down. It would also bring the shield in line with the resistances of the brushwood shield, which blocks 100% physical and fire at the expense of only blocking 30% magic damage. The reason I wouldn't reduce the magic absorption of this shield is that it would lose its unique role in countering magic damage and likely be traded for what would be objectively better, the Dark Knight shield, which has 57 stability and resistances of 100% physical and 70% magic and fire. Although it may be argued that Rune Shield sits in a similar niche with its passive magdef buff, it only has 50 stability and 60% magic res, nowhere near as game-breaking as the unmitigated DSS. Yes, the dreaded Hyper Mode. Also known as the Red Tearstone effect from Dark Souls, this effect boosts your AR, and by extension your damage, drastically when you're at low health. In Demon Souls, you have the clever rat ring that boosts your AR by 50%, and the Morion blade that boosts your AR by 60%, and they stack multiplicatively for a total potential AR multiplier of 240%. For reference, Red Tearstone from Dark Souls boosts your AR by only 30%. Proportionally speaking, the damage in Demon Souls was already very high, so this exacerbates that. I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain much more, but just to give you an idea of how intense Hyper Mode damage can be, a min-maxed mage using maximum Hyper Mode, all magic buffs, and Fire Spray, which is the weakest spell in the game, can take out a meta player in a matter of seconds. At 400-ish damage per orb, as compared to the sub 100 damage you normally get, you're looking at 3 orbs to crack second chance and another 2 to kill. That's only 10 MP required to kill a meta player through second chance. And if you've never seen Hyper Mode on DBS or Northern Regalia, it's basically a guaranteed one shot per hit. So yeah, nerf. Please. In order for BluePoint to do this game justice, they need to consider a lot of variables that they may not be fully aware of. The pacing of the combat is very fast and feels fluid, even if there's some jank to it at first glance. In some ways, it feels comparable to a fighting game, and relatively speaking, it's fairly balanced in terms of build efficacy. Most builds in the game are more or less equally good when used right. When I say that, I'm disregarding outliers such as the aforementioned weapons, buffs, and shields. So you're going to see more variety than you typically do in the other Souls games. BluePoint absolutely needs to take caution with listening to the modern Souls community when it comes to trying to determine what sort of balance and mechanical changes need to be made. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, and possibly a little elitist, but there are very good reasons for this. Most of the opinions they'll hear are from players who only have a surface-level understanding of the game. Here's the perfect example. Complaints about Backstabs being iframeable are what led to the Backstabs of Dark Souls 1, because it makes total sense to do that in a game with online multiplayer and less than ideal netcode, right? Most of the players who are begging for nerfs or buffs have either barely played the game, maybe a playthrough or two, and never experienced PvP long enough to learn from it, or they've never played and entirely base their opinions on streams or videos they saw on YouTube or Twitch. You know, those ones where the content creator, or stream sniper, or ganking party, or higher leveled summon intentionally broke or exploited something that trivialized the PvE or PvP. If you watch someone hyper spray, or use hyper homing soul arrow, or running firestorm on a boss to kill it in seconds, you're bound to think it's the magic that's broken. This is a false interpretation entirely. It is not the magic itself that's broken, it is the hyper mode and spell swap that are breaking magic. The game is designed in such a way that you're intended to look for weaknesses to exploit, which magic is designed and balanced for. If you don't believe me, the first message you should see in 2.1, which is the first level most players go to, is a developer message that tells you that the lizardmen are weak to pierce and magic. Their physical and fire defs are extremely high, which only reinforces the idea of seeking out weaknesses. BluePoint, just like these onlookers, may not understand what they're looking at and come to the same conclusions about game balance, where they see this as magic being too powerful rather than seeing the strategy behind your choice of damage type. Something I doubt they're aware of is that this game is in the unique position of having an extremely sensitive balance point. This is because of how different builds have the capacity to counter each other, sort of like a combo of RPG classes meets fighting game, which is something they need to think about. How they go about making even minor changes may drastically alter how the game plays. To put it in perspective, the PvP can be thought of as a very complex game of rock, paper, scissors, with many more options. But using the rock, paper, scissors example, we should ask what happens when you make a change to one of the choices. Let's say you add a coin flip to determine paper's effectiveness against rock. Paper beats rock every time normally, but with the coin flip, rock can beat paper 50% of the time and still beat scissors 100% of the time, thus creating a rock meta. This is a very simplified model, but it demonstrates the idea behind it all. Now consider a much larger model of, say, 8 choices, where one change can create a cascading effect of amplifying the efficacy of one or more choices while negatively affecting the others. The answers to balancing the game are not simple without having a deep understanding of what is broken, how broken it is, and why it's broken. If you were to say remove toggle escape and still have push lock, then 2-cat will be your rock meta. If you were to buff armor defenses to make armor matter more, then you're going to see a shift away from neutral melee game and create a larger crit focus due to how defense calculates a flat damage reduction on all hits. If you were to use a poise system rather than the native hyper armor system, then you would see strength weapons become extremely disadvantaged due to how heavy they are and how heavy the heavy armor is. If you were to change running while locked on from forward only to omnidirectional, then you would see a massive shift in the meta favoring ultra greatswords and dual katanas, with passive spacing and reactive running R1s to punish baited attacks. Most other weapons and playstyles suffer from not having the same aggressive potential, which will lead to a very bland and passive meta. This is something I often faced in duels on Dark Souls 3 and would not want a repeat of. There are many more examples of changes that would have similar effects if implemented wrong, which I won't get into because it's all hypothetical. It would be very wise for BluePoint to call upon the aid of veteran players who know the ins and outs of the original game to guarantee it retains its original charm while improving upon its monumental accomplishments. Yes, that's a pun. I'd happily volunteer to assist them with my 10 years of playing experience and in-depth knowledge of the game in its entirety, but the chances of a 300 sub blip on YouTube getting noticed is slim. So we can only hope for the best. For the sake of multiplayer though, there are some things they should absolutely be aware of. Don't nerf the friend ring, don't nerf the foes ring, don't nerf the damage boost phantom players trade their HP for. With the current balance of the original game, hosts and reds are almost equally matched. The host had more HP and an extra ring slot, but the invader did more damage, and they absolutely should not nerf Second Chance to be like Tears of Denial and only give 1 HP back after you hit 0. That will overwhelmingly favor dex builds, since almost all slashing weapons will quickly proc bleed with their combos. Again, another example of a rock meta. One other thing that defined Demon's Souls PvP was that, although broadly broken, you saw the most build variety in PvP of any Soulsborne, and the most build types that were relatively balanced. If BluePoint simply transfers most of the movesets, damage, etc. over to the remake and take the proper steps to ensure it remains the same, or intentionally emulate most of what the original did, then we're likely to see a similar metagame with lots of variety. This is probably one of the most important questions we can ask. What will they do with movesets? Unlike the other Soulsborne games, Demon's Souls has no poise, but absolute hyper armor. What does that mean? If you take a hit, you stagger, but some weapon classes have specific attacks where you will not stagger if you're hit by anything during that attack animation. And I mean literally anything. The only things that will pull you out of hyper armor are either a backstab, a parry, and most attacks with hyper armor aren't parryable, or death. As it is currently implemented in the original game, hyper armor is one major advantage that helps balance larger weapons. If it didn't exist, smaller weapons would unquestionably dominate, while larger weapons would primarily function as backstab sticks. Sound familiar? Yes, that's exactly why large weapons in Dark Souls are treated as backstab sticks. They're slow and easily punished, but do a ton of damage on backstabs. As such, it is important that large weapons keep their current speed and hyper armor to make them potent for defensive reads against faster weapons that would otherwise overwhelm them. Something that Demon Souls did that really held it back, though, was how some moveset slots were particularly ineffectual. The two-handed L1 and L2 of all weapons is a block. Both. Having a third moveset option besides R1 and R2 would potentially add a bit of depth to each weapon. I wouldn't advise for giving them something like a fancy weapon art from Dark Souls 3, but maybe an attack with a different animation that could help bolster the moveset of the weapon. An example of this might be a blocking shove with a two-handed Ultra that has hyper armor, isn't parryable, and easily guard breaks most shields. And something to make this even more interesting would be to have these attacks repel each other and create space, should both players use it at the same time. Another instance of useless moveset syndrome goes to two-handed or offhand catalysts. In the offhand, your catalyst L1 is used to cast, but the L2 is a weak strike. In two hands, your R2 is again a weak strike, and your L1 and L2 are both blocks. Lastly, in your right hand, the R2 of your catalyst is once more a weak strike. This needs to change. This right here presents a unique opportunity for pivot cast to be effectively replaced in favor of having different casting speeds and strengths based on what button you press. For example, if you have the catalyst offhand, your L2 might parry instead of strike, or you might gain the ability to ram into your opponent's shield to guard break them. Or you could have it as a heavy cast option, where you can charge the spell a bit longer for more damage, which may be held to a full charge for maximum damage. And similarly, these ideas could be applied to the two-handed catalyst moveset. In order for this idea to be a successful replacement of pivot cast, though, you'd have to dramatically speed up the normal casting animation of spells to roughly what pivot cast could do at its maximum speed. Any slower would severely hinder mages. Any faster, and you exacerbate potential latency issues such as prehits, which will depend on netcode and server routing. There are obviously many more examples of how movesets can be improved, weapons can be altered to be better, etc., but the nitty-gritty of it all might bore most of you, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in on my long, nerdy rant, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more content that I'll eventually get around to making. Maybe I'll do a classic Demon Souls PvP montage or two before the remake hits, huh? Stay safe, and cross your fingers, everyone. Take care.